The morning of January 27th, 1945. Chofu Airfield, southwestern Tokyo. Captain Teruhiko Kobayashi walked across the frozen tarmac toward his Kawasaki Ki-61 Hien fighter. The aircraft sat there in the pale winter light, its natural metal skin reflecting the grey clouds that hung low over Japan's capital. 24 years old, the youngest Sentai commander in the entire Imperial Japanese Army Air Force. And today, he was going to deliberately crash his fighter into a B-29 Superfortress at 30,000 feet. The intelligence briefing had been clear. American bombers were coming. Target 357, the Nakajima Aircraft Engine Factory at Musashino, the 497th Bombardment Group, 73rd Bomb Wing. Flying fortresses made of aluminum and hope, each one carrying 10 tons of incendiary bombs meant to burn Tokyo to ash. Kobayashi had read the reports. He knew what the B-29 seconds had already done to other Japanese cities. He'd seen the photographs from Nagoya, from Kobe, from Osaka, entire neighborhoods reduced to charcoal and memory. The B-29 was supposed to be impossible to stop. That's what everyone said. Too fast, too high, too heavily armed. It flew at altitudes where Japanese fighters gasped for air, their engines starving in the thin atmosphere. It bristled with remote-controlled gun turrets that could shred an attacking fighter before the pilot ever got within range. And it came in formations, dozens at a time, each bomber supporting the others with overlapping fields of fire. Kobayashi was about to discover something that would change Japanese fighter tactics for the rest of the war. The B-29 wasn't impossible to destroy, but destroying one might require destroying yourself in the process. And somehow, if you did it exactly right, you might survive. Within 90 minutes, Kobayashi would be falling through the sky in a parachute, his fighter disintegrating around him, pieces of an American bomber tumbling past. Within 3 hours, he would be sitting at a military hospital, bruised but alive, writing a report that would inspire hundreds of other pilots to attempt the same impossible tactic. Within 6 months, ramming attacks would account for dozens of B-29 seconds brought down over Japan. But history would record something else. No matter how many Japanese pilots were willing to die defending their homeland, it wouldn't be enough. The B-29 seconds kept coming, always more B-29 seconds, and in the end, Japan's most skilled pilots, flying the most desperate tactics imaginable, could not stop what was coming. Teruhiko Kobayashi had never intended to become a fighter pilot. Born on November 17, 1920, in Tokyo Prefecture, he'd grown up in a Japan rapidly transforming itself. The son of a modest family, he'd attended Kokushikan Junior High School, then earned admission to the Imperial Japanese Army Academy in the late 1930s. A significant achievement for someone of his background. Military service offered opportunities that civilian life did not. He graduated in 1940 as part of the 53rd class, commissioned as a second lieutenant. His initial assignment was artillery, the traditional path for academy graduates. But Kobayashi had other ambitions. He requested transfer to aviation and began training as a light bomber pilot. This was June 1940, more than a year before Pearl Harbor, when Japan was already deep into its war with China and preparing for larger conflicts to come. By December 1941, when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor and British possessions throughout Asia, Kobayashi was operational. He flew Kawasaki Ki-32 light bombers, an already obsolete aircraft, as part of the 45th Sentai during the Battle of Hong Kong. The campaign lasted 18 days. British and Commonwealth forces, heavily outnumbered and cut off from reinforcement, fought desperately before surrendering on Christmas Day. Kobayashi conducted bombing runs against British military installations and ships, close support missions, low-altitude attacks, the kind of flying where you could see the faces of the men you were trying to kill. The experience taught him something crucial about war. Individual skill mattered, but not as much as logistics and overwhelming force. Japan had won Hong Kong not through superior tactics, but through superior numbers and position. The British defenders had been competent, even courageous, but they were isolated and undersupplied. They never had a chance. Later, Kobayashi would recognize this same pattern working against Japan. After Hong Kong, he was posted to the 66th Sentai in northern Manchuria. This was supposed to be a frontline assignment, but by mid-1942, the Soviet border was quiet. Stalin had signed a non-aggression pact with Japan and was focused entirely on surviving the German invasion. The 66th Sentai flew patrols over frozen wasteland, watching for threats that never materialized. Kobayashi saw no action. He spent months in one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth, flying obsolescent bombers on pointless missions, slowly understanding that Japan's war was happening elsewhere. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. By mid-1942, it was already becoming clear that Japan faced a critical shortage. Not oil, though that was dire. Not ships, though losses were mounting. Pilots. Fighter pilots specifically. Japan's pre-war training program had produced excellent aviators, but it was slow and selective. The Navy and Army had assumed they would fight a short war against inferior opponents. They had not prepared for a grinding, multi-year conflict against the United States. American pilot training programs were graduating thousands of competent flyers every month. Japanese programs were producing hundreds. And Japanese doctrine wasted the pilots it had. No rotation policy, no systematic rest, just continuous combat until death or injury. The best pilots flew until they were killed. Their experience died with them. The shortage became so acute that the military began converting bomber pilots to fighters. Kobayashi received orders in November 1943 to report for fighter training. It was an unusual transition. Normally, pilots specialized and stayed in their role, but these were not normal times. He spent 8 months at the Aquino Army Air Service School, learning to fly fighters at the Kameyama branch. The training was intensive. Fighter tactics bore little resemblance to bomber operations. In a bomber, you flew straight toward the target, maintained formation, delivered your payload, discipline and precision. In a fighter, you hunted, you maneuvered, you thought in 3 dimensions constantly, predicting where your opponent would be, not where they were. Kobayashi proved talented. More importantly, he proved to be a natural teacher. When he completed training in June 1944, he was retained as an instructor rather than being sent to a combat unit. This was simultaneously an honor and a frustration. Japan needed experienced pilots at the front, but it also desperately needed instructors who could train the flood of raw recruits now entering the system. For 5 months, Kobayashi taught at Akano Army Airfield, Sano Army Airfield, and Hayashi Army Airfield. He watched classes of students arrive, wide-eyed 18-year-olds who had enlisted with dreams of glory. He tried to teach them enough to survive their first combat mission. He knew most wouldn't. The training time had been cut too short. Pre-war fighter pilots had received over 200 hours of flight time before entering combat. By late 1944, new pilots were being sent to frontline units with 70 hours. Some had less. They could take off and land. They could fly basic maneuvers. They could not dogfight. They could not judge distances in combat. They could not instinctively compensate for bullet drop and deflection. They died quickly. In November 1944, Kobayashi received new orders. He was to take command of the 244th Sentai, based at Chofu Airfield near Tokyo. At 24 years old, This made him the youngest Sentai commander in the entire Imperial Japanese Army Air Force. It was a desperate measure. Japan no longer had the luxury of letting promising officers gain experience slowly. The 244th had originally been formed in July 1941 as the 144th Sentai, an interceptor force assigned to defend the Tokyo metropolitan area. In April 1942, it was renumbered as the 244th. For most of the war, it had been a quiet assignment. Tokyo was deep in the Japanese interior, far beyond the range of any Allied bomber. The unit flew patrols and training missions, but saw no combat. That changed on June 15, 1944. That night, 68 B-29 Superfortresses took off from bases around Chengdu, China. They were heading for Yawata, on the island of Kyushu. The target was the Imperial Iron and Steel Works, a crucial component of Japan's war industry. This was the first attack on the Japanese home islands since the Doolittle raid in April 1942. That raid had used 16 B-25 medium bombers, launched from an aircraft carrier, a one-time stunt that caused minimal damage but massive psychological impact. The B-29 raids were different. These were heavy bombers designed specifically for this mission. They could carry 10 tons of bombs. They could fly 3,000 miles. They could cruise at over 30,000 feet, and there were already hundreds more in production. The Americans weren't planning a symbolic strike. They were planning to systematically destroy Japan's ability to wage war. The B-29 was unlike anything Japanese forces had encountered. In the Pacific War to that point, Japan had faced primarily tactical aircraft, fighters, and medium bombers designed to support ground operations or attack ships. The B-29 was a strategic weapon, designed to attack industrial targets deep inside enemy territory. Everything about it was enormous, 99 feet long, with a wingspan of 141 feet, 4 Wright R-3350 duplex Cyclone engines, each producing 2,200 horsepower, the most powerful piston engines of the time, fuel capacity of 9,000 gallons, bomb load of 20,000 pounds. It cost $640,000 per aircraft, more than a squadron of Japanese fighters. But the truly revolutionary feature was the pressurized cabin. The B-29 was designed to fly at altitudes where the air was too thin for humans to function. At 30,000 feet, atmospheric pressure is less than 1/3 of sea level. Without supplemental oxygen, a human loses consciousness in minutes. Even with oxygen, the extreme cold, typically 40 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, makes long missions agonizing. Crews in unpressurized bombers like the B-17 wore heavy, electrically heated flight suits, multiple layers of clothing, oxygen masks that frequently froze and malfunctioned. Frostbite was common. So was hypoxia from oxygen system failures. The B-29 solved this with pressurization. 3 separate compartments, nose, rear, and tail, were pressurized to simulate 8,000 feet elevation. The crew could fly in relative comfort, wearing light flight suits, no oxygen masks required for most of the mission. They could fly longer missions with less fatigue. They could operate more effectively. The pressurization system was developed by WWII Research and was extraordinarily complex for 1944 technology. The engines drove compressors that forced air into the fuselage. Regulators maintained constant pressure even as the aircraft climbed or descended. The bomb bays were not pressurized. A tunnel connected the forward and rear crew compartments. Crews could crawl through if necessary. The system required precise engineering. Any significant leak would cause rapid decompression. Any structural failure could be catastrophic. But when it worked, it gave the B-29 a crucial advantage. Japanese fighters could barely reach 30,000 feet, and when they did, they were at the ragged edge of their performance envelope. Engines starved for oxygen. Controls became sluggish. Pilots fought hypoxia and cold. The B-29 crews were comfortable, flying in shirt sleeves, pressurized and heated. The Americans were fighting a different war. The defensive armament was equally revolutionary. Previous bombers had used manned gun turrets, with gunners physically positioned at their weapons. The B-29 used a remote-controlled system developed by General Electric. 5 gun turrets, 4 on top and sides, 1 in the tail. Each turret contained 2 50-caliber Browning M2 machine guns. The tail turret also had a 20mm cannon. But the gunners weren't in the turrets. They sat at fire control stations inside the pressurized cabin, using optical sights connected to an analog computer. The computer compensated for airspeed, altitude, temperature, gravity, bullet drop. The gunner simply kept the target centered in his sight. The computer did the rest. One fire control officer could direct multiple turrets. If a fighter attacked from below, turrets on both sides of the aircraft could engage simultaneously, directed by a single gunner. The system was difficult to develop and expensive to produce, but it was devastatingly effective. Japanese pilots who survived attacks on B-29 formations reported being stunned by the volume and accuracy of defensive fire. They'd approach what they thought was a blind spot, only to have multiple turrets open fire immediately. The analog. Computers weren't perfect. They couldn't compensate for a wildly maneuvering target, but they didn't need to be perfect. They just needed to throw enough bullets into the sky to make attacks extremely dangerous. And they did. When the first B-29 seconds appeared over Yawata on the night of June 15, 1944, Japanese air defenses were caught completely unprepared. Radar detected the incoming formation, but the radar couldn't determine altitude accurately. Ground controllers scrambled fighters, sending them to intercepts at too low an altitude. By the time the fighters climbed high enough, the B-29 seconds were already over the target. The bombers flew at altitudes between 8,000 and 21,000 feet, lower than their designed operational ceiling, because they needed to conserve fuel for the long flight back to China. Even at these reduced altitudes, Japanese fighters struggled to intercept. The Nakajima Ki-43 Hayabusa, Japan's primary army fighter at the time, had a service ceiling of 36,000 feet on paper. In practice, above 25,000 feet, it became nearly uncontrollable. The engine wheezed. The controls felt like they were moving through mud. Rate of climb at high altitude was measured in minutes per 1,000 feet. If a B-29 was above you, you might never catch it. The few fighters that did reach intercept altitude faced another problem: armament. Early war Japanese fighters typically carried 2 7.7mm machine guns and 2 12.7mm machine guns. This was adequate against lightly built aircraft like the B-17 or B-24. It was utterly insufficient against the B-29. The Superfortress was built like a battleship. Heavy structural framing, redundant systems, self-sealing fuel tanks. A fighter pilot could empty his entire ammunition, load into a B-29, and watch it fly home. What Japanese fighters needed was cannon, heavy 20mm or 30mm cannon that could punch through armored structure and cause catastrophic damage. But most fighters weren't equipped with cannon. The ones that were had limited ammunition, typically 60 rounds per gun, and hitting a target at high altitude with frozen hands and limited oxygen while the target's defensive guns were shooting back was extraordinarily difficult. On that first raid, the B-29 seconds dropped bombs that fell 2 kilometers from their aim point. One bomb destroyed the Japanese secret police headquarters by accident. The Imperial Iron and Steel Works suffered minimal damage. But from a strategic standpoint, the raid was a complete success. The Americans had proven they could reach Japan. The psychological impact was enormous. Since the Doolittle raid more than 2 years earlier, the Japanese home islands had been a sanctuary. Citizens went about their daily lives, food was rationed and luxuries scarce, but there were no bombs falling. Military authorities had assured the population that Japan's defenses were impregnable. The B-29 raids shattered that illusion. If Yawata could be bombed, so could Tokyo. So could Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe. So could anywhere. The military response was immediate. Fighter units throughout the empire received orders to prepare for bomber interception. New tactics had to be developed, new weapons had to be deployed, and units near major cities, like the 244th Sentai defending Tokyo, suddenly became critically important. This was the situation when Kobayashi took command in November 1944. The 244th was equipped with approximately 40 Kawasaki Ki-61 Hien fighters. The Hien, Allied code name Tony, was one of Japan's better designs. Powered by a licensed copy of the German Daimler-Benz liquid-cooled engine, it had good high-altitude performance by Japanese standards. Maximum speed of 368 miles per hour, service ceiling of 38,000 feet, armed with two 12.7mm machine guns and two 20mm cannon, significantly better firepower than earlier Japanese fighters. The Ki-61 looked European, its inline engine and slim fuselage, giving it a profile similar to the German Bf-109 or Italian fighters. Allied intelligence initially thought it was an imported design, but even the Ki-61 struggled against B-29 seconds. It could reach the bomber's altitude, but just barely. At 30,000 feet, the Hien was sluggish and underpowered. Climbing from ground level to intercept altitude took precious minutes, by which time the bomber formation might already be over its target and turning for home. The 20mm cannon were adequate weapons, but they required hitting a specific aircraft repeatedly in vital areas, and the B-29 formations flew mutual support patterns, meaning any fighter that committed to a prolonged attack on one bomber would be engaged by gunners from multiple aircraft. Statistically, intercepting B-29 seconds was suicide. Not dramatic warrior's death-suicide, just mathematical certainty. Keep attacking bomber formations, and eventually you would be hit. Maybe it would be a lucky shot that killed you instantly. Maybe it would be damage that forced you to bail out, possibly over enemy territory or water. Maybe it would be accumulated damage, your aircraft slowly failing, forcing a crash landing that killed you on impact. The how didn't matter. The result was the same. And Kobayashi's unit was full of inexperienced pilots who had never seen combat. When he assumed command, Kobayashi immediately recognized the problem. His pilots could fly their aircraft adequately. They could not fight. Combat flying required instincts that only developed through experience or intensive training. How close could you push an intercept before defensive fire became overwhelming? How do you judge the deflection angle for a high-speed attack? How do you compensate for the fact that at 300 miles per hour closure speed, you have perhaps 2 seconds in which to fire before you overshoot? Standard training did not prepare pilots for these realities. Kobayashi instituted a brutal training regimen. The 244th would become expert at one specific tactic, the head-on attack. This was counterintuitive. Every instinct told a pilot to attack from behind, from the enemy's blind spot, where defensive fire was minimal. But the B-29 had no blind spots. Its remote turrets could engage in any direction, and from behind, an attacking fighter had to match speed with the bomber, flying in formation while trying to aim and fire, all while being shot at. The closure rate was slow. The time under fire was long. The head-on attack was different. Point your fighter directly at the bomber's nose and commit, closure rate of 600 miles per hour, closing from 1,000 meters to firing range in 6 seconds. If you timed it perfectly, opened fire at exactly the right distance, You could rake the entire length of the bomber from nose to tail, hit the cockpit, kill the pilots, hit the engines, start fires, and then, if your nerve held, dive under the bomber and escape before the gunners could track you. The problem was that it took absolute precision and iron nerves. Too far away and your bullets would miss, too close and you might not have time to dive clear. You were flying directly at a target that was shooting back. Every human instinct screams to break off, to evade, to do anything except fly straight at death. Kobayashi drilled his pilots relentlessly. He used every technique he'd learned as an instructor. Repetition until the movements became automatic. Incremental progression, mastering each element before moving to the next. And he led by example, flying every training mission himself, demonstrating that the tactic worked. His men began to believe. Maybe they could do this. Maybe they could stop the B-29 seconds. By early December 1944, the 244th Sentai was as ready as it would ever be. Kobayashi had transformed a collection of inexperienced pilots into a cohesive unit focused on a single mission: defend Tokyo against B-29 raids. But ready or not, the real test was coming. On November 24, 1944, 111 B-29 seconds took off from newly constructed airfields in the Mariana Islands. The target was Tokyo itself, specifically the Musashino aircraft plant on the city's outskirts. The American capture of Saipan, Tinian, and Guam in the summer of 1944 had changed everything. The Marianas were 1,500 miles from Tokyo, well within B-29 range, and unlike the bases in China, which required every gallon of fuel and every bomb to be flown in over the Himalayas, the Marianas could be supplied by ship. The Americans could sustain operations indefinitely. They could launch hundreds of bombers. They could come back day after day, mission after mission, until there was nothing left to bomb. This first mission from the Marianas was not particularly successful from an American perspective. Only 24 of the 111 B-29 seconds actually bombed the primary target. Weather, mechanical problems, and navigation difficulties scattered the formation. The Musashino plant suffered minor damage, but the raid demonstrated that Tokyo was now within regular striking distance. The sanctuary was gone. The 244th Sentai scrambled to intercept, but arrived after most bombers had already departed. The few encounters were inconclusive. Both sides learned from the experience. The Americans refined their tactics and procedures. The Japanese prepared for the next raid. It came on December 3, 1944. Intelligence reported another large formation heading for Tokyo. Kobayashi assembled his pilots in the pre-dawn darkness. Among them were three men who would make history that day. First Lieutenant Toru Shinomiya, Sergeant Masao Itagaki, and Sergeant Matsumi Nakano. All three had volunteered for a special unit within the 244th, called the Shinten Tai, the Sky Shadow Unit. This was the ramming unit. The concept had emerged from desperation and cold calculation. Conventional attacks on B-29 seconds had a very low success rate. A skilled pilot, with good positioning and adequate ammunition, might damage a bomber. Shooting one down was difficult. The Superfortress could absorb tremendous damage and keep flying. Its redundant systems, multiple engines, robust structure, all contributed to remarkable survivability. Damaged B-29 seconds routinely made it back to base with engines shot out, huge holes in the fuselage, wounded crew members. Japanese pilots reported emptying their ammunition into bombers that simply flew on. The ramming attack offered mathematical certainty. Fly your fighter into the bomber with sufficient force, and both aircraft would be destroyed. The fighter would disintegrate. The bomber would suffer catastrophic structural failure and go down. One fighter for one bomber was, from a strategic standpoint, an acceptable trade. A Key 61 cost perhaps $50,000 to produce. A B-29 cost over $600,000 and carried 11 trained crew members who had each received months of expensive training. Destroy enough B-29 seconds, and the raids would stop. The Americans would run out of bombers, or more importantly, they would run out of willingness to accept losses. That was the theory. The reality was more complex. The ramming attack required the pilot to deliberately fly his aircraft into another aircraft traveling at hundreds of miles per hour. The forces involved in such a collision were tremendous. The fighter would come apart instantly. The pilot's survival depended on split-second timing, incredible luck, or both. This was not a suicide tactic in the same way that kamikaze attacks against ships were. Kamikaze pilots were expected to die. Ramming pilots were expected to try to survive. Strip unnecessary equipment from the fighter to reduce weight and improve high-altitude performance. Approach the bomber at high speed from a favorable angle. Impact the bomber's wing or tail, not the fuselage where the structure was strongest. At the moment of impact, attempt to bail out. The fighter would break up, but if the pilot could separate from the wreckage quickly enough, deploy his parachute before hitting the ground, he might live. Several pilots had already survived ramming attacks by accident or desperation. In August 1944, during raids on Manchuria, Sergeant Shinobu Ikeda of the 25th Dokuritsu Chutai had rammed his Key 45 into a B-29 called Galloping Goose. All but one crew member of the B-29 died. So did Sergeant Ikeda. But the fact that it was possible had been proven. Other pilots, finding their ammunition exhausted and the bomber still flying, had deliberately collided, sometimes surviving. The Sentai formalized this into doctrine. Select volunteers. Provide specialized training. Equip them with modified aircraft. And send them against the bombers with the explicit mission to ram if necessary. On the morning of December 3rd, the three pilots climbed into their fighters. The aircraft had been stripped of some armor and armament to reduce weight. Every kilogram mattered at high altitude. Kobayashi gave final instructions. Wait for my signal. Execute as trained. Survive if possible. But stop the bombers. The B-29 formation appeared on radar just after dawn. Ground controllers vectored the interceptors toward the incoming raid. Kobayashi led his formation up through the cloud layer, climbing hard for altitude. At 20,000 feet, the air became noticeably thinner. At 25,000 feet, engines began to labor. At 28,000 feet, the Key 61 seconds leveled off, still climbing but slowly now, gasping in the thin air. And there, above them, were the B-29 seconds, 78 Superfortresses in tight formation, sunlight glinting off polished, aluminum, vapor trails streaming behind. They looked invincible. Kobayashi called out the attack. His fighters accelerated, trading altitude for speed, setting up for head-on passes. The range closed rapidly. 1,000 meters, 800 meters, 600 meters. The bombers' defensive guns opened fire. Tracers filled the sky. Kobayashi ignored them. Everything depended on maintaining course, maintaining speed, waiting for exactly the right moment. 400 meters. He opened fire. His 20mm cannon sent shells streaking toward the lead bomber. Hits sparked along the fuselage. Then he was diving under the bomber, pulling hard, the G-forces crushing him into his seat, his vision tunneling. He rolled level and looked back. Behind him, chaos. First Lieutenant Shinomiya had lined up on a B, 29 inches, the second element. His fighter ploughed directly into the bomber's wing. The impact was catastrophic. The Key 61 disintegrated instantly. Fragments of aircraft spinning away in all directions. The B-29's wing folded upward, the entire aircraft rolling violently. Shinomiya had somehow managed to bail out at the instant of impact. His parachute deployed. He was alive. The B-29 went down. Sergeant Itagaki had attacked another bomber, raking it with cannon fire. His fighter was hit by defensive fire, smoke streaming from the engine. He continued the attack until his aircraft became unflyable, then bailed out. His damaged Ki-61 tumbled away, missing the bomber but still forcing it out of formation. Sergeant Nakano had committed fully to the ramming attack. His stripped-down Ki-61 had better high-altitude performance than standard models. He climbed above the formation, rolled inverted, and dove on a B-29 from above. His fighter struck the bomber's tail section. Both aircraft shuddered from the impact. The B-29's tail controls were damaged. The bomber, long distance of the 498th Bombardment Group, began falling out of formation. Nakano's fighter was wrecked but still partially controllable. He managed a crash landing in a field. He survived. In a single attack, the 244th Sentai had demonstrated that ramming attacks could work. 3 pilots had deliberately collided with bombers. All 3 had survived. The bombers they hit had either been destroyed or forced to abort the mission. It was a tactical success, but it was also completely unsustainable. Kobayashi understood this immediately. Yes, the attacks had worked. Yes, the pilots had survived. But that was mostly luck. Shinomiya had bailed out at exactly the right instant. Nakano had hit the tail section, the weakest part of the bomber's structure, and his fighter had remained controllable long enough to crash land. A slightly different angle, a slightly different speed, and both men would be dead. The Americans were losing bombers, but they were building them faster than Japan could destroy them. Boeing, Bell, and Martin factories in the United States were producing 16 B-29 seconds per day by late 1944. 16 per day. That was more than 11,000 per year. Japan's entire fighter production across all types was about 30,000 aircraft per year, and that number was declining as American bombing disrupted Japanese industry. Even if every ramming attack succeeded, even if every pilot survived, the mathematics were impossible. Japan didn't have enough pilots, didn't have enough fighters, didn't have enough fuel, didn't have enough time. But what else could they do? The alternative was to let the bombers through unopposed, to watch Tokyo burn, to accept defeat without fighting. So the ramming attacks continued. The Japanese press celebrated the December 3rd mission. Newspapers published daily accounts of the 244th Sentai's exploits. Captain Kobayashi became famous. The youngest Sentai commander, leading his men in desperate attacks against impossible odds, personified the warrior spirit Japanese propaganda desperately needed. What the newspapers didn't report was the cost. Fighters lost to mechanical failure, pilots killed in accidents during training, aircraft damaged beyond repair in combat, experienced pilots wounded and unable to fly. The 244th was being ground down by attrition. Every mission cost aircraft and pilots that could not be replaced. Kobayashi trained new pilots as fast as they arrived, but their skill level was declining. Early recruits had 50 or 60 hours of flight training. By late 1944, new pilots arrived with 40 hours or less. Some had never fired their guns in flight. Some had never flown in formation. They were taught to take off, fly straight and level, and land. Then they were sent to defend Tokyo against the most advanced bombers in the world. On December 22, 1944, another raid. Kobayashi personally led the intercept. He executed a perfect head-on attack against a B-29 targeting a Mitsubishi factory. His cannon shells damaged the bomber's No. 3 engine. Smoke poured from the cowling. The bomber fell out of formation and eventually failed to return to its base. Kobayashi claimed it as a kill, though he couldn't confirm the final outcome. The bomber might have crashed. It might have made an emergency landing somewhere. In the confusion of high-altitude combat, certainty was impossible, but damaged bombers that left formation rarely survived. The attacks continued through December and into January. The American raids grew larger and more frequent. By January 1945, formations of 300 or more B-29 seconds were common. The Japanese defenses were overwhelmed. Too few fighters, too many bombers. Ground-based anti-aircraft guns had difficulty reaching the altitudes at which B-29 seconds operated. The heavy anti-aircraft guns had adequate range but insufficient accuracy. The lighter guns were more accurate but couldn't reach high enough. The B-29 seconds flew in a sweet spot between the two, high enough to avoid light flak, fast enough to make heavy flak ineffective. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Japanese fighter tactics evolved rapidly. The head-on attack remained the primary method, but pilots experimented with variations. Some tried diving attacks from directly above, using gravity to increase closing speed. Some tried formation attacks, multiple fighters hitting a single bomber simultaneously to overwhelm its defenses. Some tried night attacks, using darkness to close undetected. All of these tactics worked occasionally. None worked consistently. The fundamental problem remained. The B-29 was simply too tough. It could absorb damage that would destroy other aircraft, and there were always more of them. On January 27, 1945, Kobayashi received intelligence about another raid. The 497th Bombardment Group was returning. Target 357, the same Nakajima engine factory they'd attacked before. This factory had been bombed repeatedly. The Americans were determined to destroy it completely. Each raid caused damage, but Japanese repair crews worked continuously to restore production. This was the pattern throughout Japan. Bomb a factory, the factory repairs itself and resumes production, bomb it again. The cycle continued until either the factory was completely destroyed or the war ended. Kobayashi walked to his Key 61 that morning, knowing this might be his last mission, not in a fatalistic sense, but in a statistical sense. He'd been flying combat missions for 2 months. Every flight increased the probability of being hit. Eventually, luck ran out. His fighter bore the markings of his rank and unit, the distinctive shamrock insignia that had become his personal symbol. On the fuselage, small silhouettes marking his victories. 3 B-29 seconds destroyed or damaged. 2 F-6F Hellcats shot down in dogfights with carrier-based fighters. 5 kills total, enough to qualify as an ace by most standards, though Japanese doctrine didn't emphasize individual scores the way American or German forces did. He started the engine. The Ha-40 inline engine fired with a smooth rumble. Instrumentation showed normal, fuel full, ammunition loaded, everything as it should be. He taxied to the runway, received clearance, and took off. The Key 61 accelerated smoothly, lifting off at 120 knots, gear up, flaps up, climbing attitude. The other fighters of the 244th formed up on his wings. They climbed through scattered clouds toward the intercept altitude. At 28,000 feet, they found the B-29 seconds, a massive formation, over 100 bombers in tight elements, covering miles of sky. Their vapor trails created an artificial cloud layer. The rumble of 400 engines was audible, even over the sound of Kobayashi's own engine. He'd seen this sight dozens of times now. It never stopped being intimidating. Ground controllers radioed vectors and altitude information. The bomber stream was heading directly for Tokyo. Estimated time to target, 12 minutes. Kobayashi checked his formation. 18 fighters. 18 Key 61 seconds against over 100 B-29 seconds. The mathematics were absurd. But absurd mathematics were all Japan had left. He selected his target, a B-29's, the lead element, slightly ahead of the others. If he could hit the lead aircraft, force it to break formation, the entire element might be disrupted. The B-29 seconds flew precise formations for mutual defensive support. Break the formation, and individual bombers became more vulnerable. He radioed his attack plan. His wingmen would follow him in. The others would engage targets of opportunity, execute on his mark. Kobayashi rolled his fighter into attack position. He was above and ahead of the bomber now. He pushed the nose down, trading altitude for speed. The airspeed indicator climbed. 280 knots. 300 knots. 320. The Key 61 was diving nearly vertically now, plummeting toward the B-29 formation. At this speed, the controls stiffened. The aircraft wanted to continue diving. Pulling out would require strength and perfect timing. Kobayashi lined up his shot. The geometry of deflection shooting required calculating where the target would be, not where it was. At a closure rate of over 500 miles per hour, the bomber would travel hundreds of feet in the time it took his cannon shells to reach it. He had to aim ahead of the target, lead it like a duck hunter leads a flying bird. His gun sight showed the proper lead angle. He made minute adjustments, stick and rudder inputs so small they were almost unconscious. The bomber filled his windscreen. 1,000 meters range, 800 meters, 600 meters, 500. The bomber's dorsal. Turret opened fire. He could see the muzzle flashes. Tracers streaked past. Something hit his wing. A .50 caliber round punched through the aluminum skin, but the wing stayed intact. 400 meters. He pressed the firing button. His 20mm cannon roared. The recoil shuddered through the airframe. Cannon shells walked up the B-29's fuselage. Hits sparkled along the cockpit section, the inboard engine, the wing root. 300 meters. 200. Too close. Way too close. He had to pull out now or he'd collide. Kobayashi pulled back on the stick with both hands. The G-forces slammed him down into his seat, his vision greyed at the edges. The aircraft groaned, the airframe stressed beyond its design limits. But it held together. He flashed under the bomber with less than 50 feet of clearance. And then something was catastrophically wrong. He looked back and saw what had happened. His diving attack had been too aggressive. At the last instant, as he pulled out, his wing had clipped the B-29's tail section. Not a full ramming attack, just a glancing blow. But at 300 knots even a glancing blow was devastating. His port wing was crumpled, the aileron was gone, control cables severed. The fighter rolled left uncontrollably. He fought the stick, but it was useless. The aircraft was tumbling now, spinning, falling, altitude bleeding away rapidly. 25,000 feet, 20,000, 15,000. He had seconds to make a decision. Try to regain control or bail out. Staying with the aircraft meant almost certain death. A tumbling fighter at terminal velocity would hit the ground in less than a minute. Kobayashi reached down and released his harness. The canopy was already partially open from battle damage. He pushed himself up and out. The slipstream caught him instantly, ripping him away from the disintegrating fighter. He tumbled through the air. Sky, ground, spinning wildly. He pulled the ripcord. The parachute deployed with a violent jerk. The spinning stopped. Suddenly everything was quiet. The roar of engines and combat was replaced by an eerie silence. He was floating. Below him, pieces of his Key 61 were falling, tumbling end over end, burning as they fell. Further away, he could see the B-29 he'd attacked. It was also going down. His cannon fire and the collision had caused critical damage. The bomber's tail section was partially severed. It rolled inverted and entered a flat spin. Pieces broke off as it fell. Both aircraft hit the ground within seconds of each other. Explosions bloomed. Black smoke rose. Kobayashi drifted down. The parachute was working perfectly. He had time to assess his condition. No serious injuries. Some bruising from the ejection. His right shoulder hurt where the harness had caught him. But he was alive. He'd survived a ramming attack. Not by design. The collision had been accidental, a consequence of pushing the attack too aggressively. But he'd survived. He hit the ground in a rice paddy on the outskirts of Tokyo. The impact knocked the wind out of him, but caused no additional injuries. Local civil defense personnel reached him within minutes. They'd watched the dogfight overhead and had seen his parachute. He was helped to a vehicle and driven to a military hospital. Army doctors examined him thoroughly. Bruised ribs, strained shoulder, minor cuts and abrasions. Nothing serious. They wanted to keep him for observation, but he refused. His men were still in combat. He needed to get back to Chofu Airfield. By the time he returned, the mission was over. The raid had been partially successful from the American perspective. Bombs had hit the Nakajima factory, causing moderate damage. From the Japanese perspective, they'd extracted a cost. 5 B-29 seconds had been shot down or badly damaged. Dozens more carried battle damage. The 497th Bombardment Group would report this as a difficult mission, with strong fighter opposition. The 244th had lost 3 fighters, 1 pilot killed, 2 others wounded, including Kobayashi, but he was alive, and he'd proven something important. A ramming attack, even an accidental one, could bring down a B-29, and the pilot could survive. That evening, Kobayashi wrote his report. This was standard procedure after any combat mission. Detailed description of events, assessment of tactics, recommendations for future operations. His report noted the accidental nature of the collision but emphasized that the result was nonetheless valuable. The ramming tactic was viable. With proper training and execution, survival was possible. The report went up through channels. It reached General Staff Headquarters in Tokyo. It was discussed and analyzed, and the conclusion was that ramming attacks should be encouraged and formalized. Volunteers would be trained specifically for this mission. Modified aircraft would be provided. The Sentai would expand beyond the 244th Sentai to other units. The official name for the tactic was Tayatari, literally body hit or collision. The pilots who flew these missions were considered heroes, not suicide attackers. They were expected to survive. Many did. Many didn't. First Lieutenant Shinomiya, who'd survived the December 3rd ramming attack, was killed in a later mission. Sergeant Nakano survived the war. Sergeant Itagaki was wounded but recovered and flew combat missions until the surrender. The statistics were grim. Of pilots who attempted ramming attacks, approximately 30% survived. Those were better odds than kamikaze attacks against ships, which were explicitly one-way missions, but they were still terrible odds. And yet volunteers continued to come forward, young men, often barely out of flight school, who believed that sacrificing their lives, or at least risking them with extraordinary courage, could save Japan. Kobayashi returned to combat within days. His shoulder healed. His confidence was shaken but intact. He'd survived death by the narrowest of margins. That gave him a strange kind of fatalism. He'd been lucky once. Maybe he'd be lucky again. Or maybe not. Either way, the bombers kept coming. Through February and March of 1945, the intensity of American bombing operations increased dramatically. General Curtis LeMay, who'd taken command of XXI Bomber Command in January, implemented a radical change in tactics. Instead of high-altitude precision bombing during daylight, he ordered low-altitude incendiary attacks at night. The B-29 seconds would come in at 5,000 to 8,000 feet, carrying nothing but incendiary bombs, often with reduced defensive armament to increase bomb load. The target wasn't military installations or factories. The target was the cities themselves. On the night of March 9th to 10th, 1945, 334 B-29 seconds attacked Tokyo. Operation Meeting House. The bombers carried thousands of M69 incendiary clusters. Each cluster contained 38 individual bomblets filled with napalm. When dropped, the clusters would break apart at altitude, scattering the bomblets across a wide area. The bomblets would ignite on impact, starting fires that spread rapidly through Tokyo's densely packed wooden neighborhoods. The attack created a firestorm. Fires merged and generated their own weather, creating winds that reached hurricane force. The flames consumed oxygen faster than the atmosphere could replace it. People suffocated before they burned. Firestorms generated their own thermal columns, lifting burning debris thousands of feet into the air, where winds carried it to start new fires miles away. 15.8 square miles of Tokyo burned completely. Over 100,000 people died in a single night, more than either atomic bomb would kill. The casualties exceeded the Great Kanto earthquake of 1923, previously the deadliest disaster in Tokyo's history. The 244th Sentai scrambled to intercept, but night operations were extraordinarily difficult. Finding bombers in darkness required either ground-controlled interception with radar guidance or visual detection, typically when the fighter passed between the bomber and ground fires. Japanese night fighter capabilities were primitive. Few aircraft had airborne radar. Pilot training for night operations was minimal. Most fighters never made contact with the bombers. The few that did found that attacking at low altitude presented different challenges than high-altitude interception. At 8,000 feet, the air was thick enough that both fighters and bombers performed well, but the B-29 seconds were faster at low altitude than Japanese fighters. A Ki-61 at 8,000 feet might reach 350 miles per hour in level flight. A B-29 at the same altitude could reach 330 miles per hour. The speed difference was minimal, and without the altitude advantage that allowed diving attacks, Japanese fighters had to match speed with the bombers while approaching, making them vulnerable to defensive fire for extended periods. Kobayashi flew that night. He managed to close on one bomber, got within firing range, and damaged it with cannon fire. The bomber continued flying. He tried to follow for a second attack but lost it in the darkness and smoke. When dawn came, Tokyo was still burning. Entire neighborhoods had ceased to exist. The death toll wouldn't be calculated for days. The industrial damage was severe but not crippling. Many small workshops and factories that subcontracted for major manufacturers had been destroyed, disrupting production chains. But the major plants, often built with fireproof construction, had mostly survived. The Americans had learned something from the Tokyo raid. Firebombing worked. The human cost was enormous, and that would raise moral questions that persist to this day. But from a military effectiveness standpoint, incendiary attacks on Japanese cities achieved results that high-altitude precision bombing had not. Over the following months, LeMay's forces systematically burned Japan's major cities. Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, Yokohama all suffered massive incendiary raids. By war's end, over 60 Japanese cities had been substantially destroyed. The 244th Sentai continued operations. Kobayashi led mission after mission. On April 12, 1945, he damaged another B-29, but was wounded in the process. Shrapnel from an exploding anti-aircraft shell, Japanese anti-aircraft fire, struck his fighter. Fragments pierced the canopy and hit him in the left leg, not life-threatening, but painful and debilitating. He managed to land his damaged aircraft and was taken to a hospital. Recovery took several weeks. By May 1945, the character of the air war had shifted again. American carrier task forces now operated off the coast of Japan with near impunity. The Imperial Japanese Navy had been destroyed at Leyte Gulf in October 1944. The remaining ships were bottled up in ports, lacking fuel to operate. American carriers could launch strikes against targets throughout Japan without serious opposition. Navy F-6F Hellcats and F-4U Corsairs now appeared over Tokyo regularly, strafing airfields, bombing installations, engaging any Japanese fighters that rose to challenge them. The 244th received new aircraft in May. The Ki-100, an evolution of the Ki-61, with a more reliable radial engine replacing the troublesome inline engine. The Ki-100 was considered by many to be the best fighter Japan produced during the war. Excellent handling, good high-altitude performance, reliable engine. It came too late and in too few numbers to matter strategically. But for the pilots who flew it, the Ki-100 was a significant improvement. Kobayashi flew the Ki-100 for the first time in late May and was impressed. The aircraft felt solid, responsive, powerful. If only they'd had this 2 years earlier. But 2 years earlier, Japan had thought it was winning the war. On July 25, 1945, Kobayashi and his men were ordered to stand down. American carriers were operating off the coast. Intelligence reported incoming strikes, but higher command wanted to preserve aircraft for the expected invasion. Japan's plan, Operation Ketsugo, called for hoarding fighters and using them in mass kamikaze attacks against invasion fleets. Every aircraft was precious. Don't waste them on defensive missions. Kobayashi disagreed vehemently. F-6F Hellcats from VF-31 off the carrier USS Belleau Wood were attacking Yokkaichi Airfield. His men could see them, diving on parked aircraft, strafing buildings, and they were supposed to sit here and watch? Kobayashi made a decision that would nearly end his career. He ignored the stand-down order. He and his pilots scrambled their Ki-100 seconds and engaged the American fighters. The dogfight took place at low altitude, sometimes barely above hangar height. The Ki-100 seconds were roughly equivalent to the F-6F in performance. The Japanese pilots had the advantage of fighting over their own airfield. The Americans had the advantage of numbers and experience. The fight was vicious and confused. Both sides lost 2 aircraft. Kobayashi's unit claimed 10 kills, a wild exaggeration born of combat confusion. American records showed 2 F-6Fs lost, but the 244th had defended their airfield. Japanese newspapers celebrated the action. The public loved it. A small victory in a war that had become an endless string of defeats. Higher command was less enthusiastic. Kobayashi had directly disobeyed orders. In the Imperial Japanese Army, this was an extremely serious offense. A court-martial was convened. The charges were clear. Disobeying direct orders during wartime. The potential. Punishment was severe, potentially including execution. But something unusual happened. Word of Kobayashi's action reached Emperor Hirohito. The emperor, normally not involved in operational military matters, expressed approval. A young officer showing initiative and courage to defend Japan. This was the spirit needed. With imperial approval stated, the court-martial was dropped. Kobayashi returned to duty. But the reprieve was temporary. Events beyond anyone's control were moving toward conclusion. On August 6, 1945, a single B-29 called Enola Gay dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. The city was destroyed instantly. 70,000 people died immediately. Thousands more in the following weeks from radiation sickness. 3 days later, on August 9th, another B-29, Boxcar, dropped a second atomic bomb on Nagasaki, 40,000 dead immediately. Japan's military leadership was divided. Some argued for continuing the war. The homeland could still be defended. The people would fight to the last. The Americans would suffer such casualties in an invasion that they would negotiate. Others recognized reality. Japan was defeated. The cities were destroyed. The population was starving. The military was out of fuel, ammunition, and aircraft. The atomic bombs demonstrated that America could destroy Japanese cities one at a time without risking a single soldier. Continuing the war meant national extinction. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito addressed the nation by radio. It was the first time most Japanese citizens had ever heard his voice. He announced that Japan would accept the terms of the Potsdam Declaration. Unconditional surrender. The war was over. For Kobayashi and the 244th Sentai, the announcement was devastating. They'd fought with everything they had. They'd developed tactics that worked. They'd shot down dozens of B-29 seconds. Their commander had personally rammed a bomber and survived. And none of it had mattered. The B-29 seconds had kept coming. The cities had burned. Japan had lost. The mathematics had been insurmountable from the beginning. Japan had fought the war with approximately 600,000 aircrew trained between 1941 and 1945, including pilots, navigators, bombardiers, gunners, radio operators, and ground crew. The United States trained over 2.3 million aircrew during the same period, nearly 4 times as many. Japan produced approximately 70,000 aircraft between 1941 and 1945. The United States produced over 300,000. The industrial disparity was even more dramatic. At peak production in 1944, Japanese aircraft plants produced approximately 2,000 aircraft per month. American plants produced 16,000 per month, 8 times as many. And American aircraft were generally more advanced, with better engines, better systems, better reliability. The B-29 itself embodied this disparity. It was a weapon system that only a fully industrialized nation with massive resources could produce. The pressurization system alone required manufacturing capabilities beyond Japan's reach. The analog computers for the fire control system were technological marvels that Japan couldn't replicate. The Wright R-3350 engines, while temperamental by American standards, were more reliable than most Japanese engines. Everything about the B-29 demonstrated American industrial and technological superiority. Japanese fighters, including the Ki-61 and Ki-100, were well-designed aircraft that compared favorably to Allied fighters in many respects. Japanese pilots were often skilled and courageous. Japanese tactics, including the ramming attacks, showed creativity and determination. None of it was enough. You cannot win a modern industrial war through courage alone. Production matters. Logistics matters. Training pipeline matters. Technological infrastructure matters. Japan had excellent individual components, skilled pilots, decent fighters, innovative tactics, but the system was unsustainable. Every loss was difficult to replace. Every trained pilot killed represented months of investment that couldn't be recovered. American losses were replaced quickly. Damaged B-29 seconds were repaired. Lost B-29 seconds were replaced from the production line. Killed crew members were replaced from training schools that graduated thousands every month. The United States could sustain the campaign indefinitely. Japan could not. The final statistics tell the story. From June 1944 through August 1945, B-29 seconds flew approximately 33,000 sorties against Japanese targets. total losses were 414 aircraft. 147 were lost to enemy action, flak and fighters combined. 267 were operational losses, mechanical failures, crashes, accidents. The loss rate was 1.38% per sortie. Compared to the strategic bombing campaign over Germany, where B-17 and B-24 losses sometimes exceeded 10% per mission, the B-29 campaign was remarkably successful. Japanese defenses claimed about 200 B-29 seconds shot down, accounting for overclaiming and duplication. The actual number was lower, perhaps 150. Many bombers claimed as shot down actually made emergency landings or crashed due to battle damage, rather than being destroyed in the air. But even accepting the higher number, the mathematics are clear. Japan destroyed approximately 200 B-29 seconds. The United States produced over 3,900. For every B-29 Japan shot down, America built 20 more. The ramming attacks, while dramatic and occasionally successful, accounted for only a small fraction of B-29 losses. Perhaps 30 bombers were destroyed by ramming attacks over the entire war. The cost was high. Dozens of pilots killed, hundreds of fighters destroyed. The survival rate for ramming attacks was approximately 30%. Most pilots who attempted the tactic died. Kobayashi survived through a combination of skill, timing, and extraordinary luck. Most weren't as fortunate. First Lieutenant Toru Shinomiya, who'd survived the first ramming mission on December 3, 1944, was killed in a later attack. Many others died in training accidents, combat with escort fighters, or operational losses. The 244th Sentai claimed 73 B-29 seconds destroyed and 92 damaged over the course of the war. These were overclaimed figures, common in air combat, where multiple pilots attack the same target and each claims the kill. The actual number was probably half that, but even if we accept the higher number, 73 bombers destroyed, the Americans flew over 33,000 sorties. The 244th stopped 0.22% of the attacks. 0.22%. That's the brutal arithmetic of industrial warfare. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. Kobayashi survived the war. He was 24 years old when Japan surrendered, an age when most men are just starting their careers. He'd already lived a lifetime. Combat veteran at 21, fighter ace at 23, Sentai commander at 24, famous throughout Japan for his courage, and now unemployed in a defeated nation. Japan, after the surrender, was a traumatic place. Cities destroyed, population displaced, economy collapsed, millions dead. The occupation forces, primarily American, arrived and began the process of demilitarization. The Imperial Japanese Army and Navy were dissolved. Military personnel were discharged. Aircraft were destroyed or confiscated. Chofu Airfield was taken over by American forces. The 244th Sentai ceased to exist. Kobayashi transitioned to civilian life. For 9 years, he worked various jobs in a Japan struggling to rebuild. The nation was transforming from a militaristic empire into a democratic, pacifist state. The new constitution, written largely by American occupation authorities, included Article 9, which renounced war as a sovereign right and prohibited maintaining military forces. Japan would rely on American protection. But by the early 1950s, the Cold War had changed calculations. The Korean War demonstrated that East Asia remained unstable. American military planners concluded that Japan needed self-defense capabilities. In 1954, the National Safety Force was reorganized into the Japan Self-Defense Forces, officially not a military, just self-defense forces. Legally distinct under Article 9, practically an Air Force, Navy, and Army by different names. The newly created Japan Air Self-Defense Force needed experienced pilots and commanders. Kobayashi was recruited. At 33 years old, he returned to flying. Not combat missions this time, but training and defense operations in a democratic Japan allied with its former enemy. He entered the JASDF Executive School and qualified on jet aircraft. The F-86 Sabre, America's frontline fighter during the Korean War. Fast, maneuverable, armed with 650 caliber machine guns or rockets, infinitely more advanced than the Ki-61 he'd flown 10 years earlier. In November 1955, Kobayashi went to the United States for training, 6 months studying American fighter operations, tactics, and procedures. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was being trained by the same military he'd fought against, flying aircraft built by the nation whose bombers he'd tried to destroy. But this was the new reality. Japan and America were allies now. The past was the past. Kobayashi served at Matsushima and Tsuiki air bases, training the next generation of Japanese pilots. He was an excellent instructor, patient and thorough, with a gift for explaining complex concepts simply. His wartime experience gave him credibility. The younger pilots respected him. He'd been there. He'd fought. He'd survived. He knew what he was talking about. But the war had taken its toll. Kobayashi's health had never fully recovered from his combat injuries and the stress of sustained operations. In 1957, at age 36, he died. The official cause was listed as illness related to wartime service. He was buried with military honors. His legacy was complex, unquestionably brave, skilled pilot and leader, but also a participant in a war that Japan should never have fought, defending tactics that required pilots to crash their aircraft into enemies. In the post-war period, many in Japan struggled with how to remember the war. Were the pilots heroes for defending their homeland, or were they victims of a militaristic government that wasted their lives in an unwinnable conflict? The answer, like most historical truths, is complicated. Both things can be true simultaneously. The B-29 campaign against Japan remains one of history's most controversial military operations. The strategic effectiveness is undeniable. By August 1945, Japanese industry was largely destroyed. Transportation networks were paralyzed. Food distribution had collapsed. The population was on the edge of starvation. Militarily, continuing the war was impossible. The atomic bombs ended the war, but the conventional bombing campaign had already made Japan's defeat inevitable. The moral questions are more difficult. The firebombing of Japanese cities killed hundreds of thousands of civilians. The atomic bombs killed hundreds of thousands more. These were deliberate attacks on urban areas designed to maximize casualties and psychological impact. International law at the time provided limited protections for civilians, but the scale of the bombing campaign troubled even some of its participants. Was it necessary? Would Japan have surrendered without the atomic bombs, without the firebombing? Would a naval blockade alone have forced surrender? These questions remain debated. What's undeniable is that the B-29 campaign worked. It achieved its objectives. Japan surrendered. The war ended. For the Japanese pilots who fought the B-29 seconds, there's a tragic futility to their struggle. Everything Kobayashi learned about ramming tactics, everything the 244th Sentai accomplished, all the courage and sacrifice of Japanese fighter pilots, it slowed the bombers but couldn't stop them. The industrial and technological disparity was too great. Japan was fighting a 19th century war with early 20th century equipment against a mid-20th century superpower. The outcome was predetermined. But that doesn't diminish the human stories. Kobayashi was 24 years old when he deliberately crashed his fighter into a bomber at 30,000 feet and survived. 24. Most people at that age are finishing college, starting careers, falling in love, planning futures. Kobayashi was calculating the exact angle and speed necessary to destroy an aircraft while ejecting at the last possible moment. His survival was remarkable. The survival of any ramming pilot was remarkable. The forces involved in a mid-air collision at 300 knots are tremendous. Aircraft disintegrate. Pilots are thrown from their cockpits, often unconscious or disoriented. Parachutes fail to deploy or deploy too late. The fact that any pilot survived a ramming attack is testimony to extraordinary reflexes, timing, and luck. The lesson, if there is one, transcends the specific tactics and technologies. In sustained industrial conflict, production capacity matters more than individual heroism. Training pipeline matters more than individual skill. Logistics and sustainability matter more than tactical innovation. Japan's pilots were brave. The ramming tactics were creative. The determination to defend the homeland was admirable. None of it was sufficient, because the underlying strategic situation was hopeless. You cannot defeat an enemy that can replace losses faster than you can inflict them. You cannot win when your opponent produces 8 times as many aircraft, trains 4 times as many pilots, and has technological advantages in engines, systems, and weapons. The mathematics were against Japan from the beginning. Kobayashi and pilots like him fought anyway because they didn't have a choice. Their nation was at war. They had skills that were needed. They did their duty as they understood it. We can honor their courage while recognizing the futility of their mission. The B-29 itself was a marvel of engineering and industrial organization. Designing it required solving problems that had never been solved before. Pressurization at scale, remote gun control, high-altitude bombing accuracy. Engines powerful enough to push a heavy airframe at high speeds. Boeing, the U.S. Army, Air Forces, and hundreds of subcontractors worked together to create an aircraft that could do what no previous bomber could do. Reach any target on Earth, fly higher and faster than defending fighters, deliver devastating bomb loads accurately, and do it repeatedly with acceptable losses. The program cost $3 billion, more than the Manhattan Project. But it worked. The B-29 could have changed the war in Europe if deployed earlier. Against Japan, it was decisive. Not just the atomic bombs, though those were delivered by B-29 seconds. The entire conventional campaign, burning cities, destroying factories, cutting transportation, starving the population, the Superfortress was the instrument of Japan's defeat. For Kobayashi, the final recognition came decades after his death. In Japan, he's remembered as a war hero. Books have been written about the 244th Sentai. Models of his Kai-61 with its distinctive shamrock markings are available from several manufacturers. Aviation historians study his tactics and leadership. But he's also a cautionary tale. A talented young man whose skills were put to use in a war his nation couldn't win, who survived impossible odds only to die young from the accumulated effects of combat stress and injury, who fought bravely for a cause that was, from the beginning, doomed. In the broader sweep of history, individual battles matter less than we think. The outcome of World War II was determined by industrial capacity, resources, population, technology. The United States and its allies had overwhelming advantages in all categories. No amount of tactical skill or strategic brilliance could overcome those fundamental imbalances. Japan's defeat was inevitable from the moment it attacked Pearl Harbor. Everything that happened after was just playing out the consequences. But telling history only as statistics and strategic analysis misses the human element. Wars are fought by individuals, people who have names, families, hopes, fears, people who make choices under impossible circumstances, people who show courage even when they know the cause is lost. Kobayashi rammed a B-29 at 30,000 feet and walked away. That's an extraordinary achievement regardless of which side of the war you sympathize with. It demonstrates human capability at the extreme edge of survival, and it demonstrates the absolute futility of trying to stop industrial warfare through individual action. Both things are true. Both things matter. This is the complexity of history. There are no simple lessons, only facts, contexts, and the stories of people trying to survive circumstances beyond their control.